Let's get more insight with Asher Orkaby. He's a research fellow at Harvard University who studied conflict in Yemen extensively, wrote the book Beyond the Arab Cold War, The International History of the Yemen Civil War, 1962 to 68. Asher, welcome to the program. What do you see as the most tangible progress we've seen so far from these talks?
The first major accomplishment from the UN side is the fact that the Houthis actually showed up to a brokered meeting. This has become a lingering issue. Every time there's a meeting in some European location, it's either difficult for the Houthis to come, there are threats against their lives, arrests, but they actually showed up. So showing up is already half the battle, and that's one of the major accomplishments at this time.
What do you make of this agreement on swapping prisoners? What can you tell us about that, and how significant is it?
It's not entirely significant. I think it's more symbolic. Swapping prisoners has been part of Yemen's major accomplishments over many decades. This is swapping prisoners is definitely symbolic in and of itself. How many prisoners actually have been taken on either side? The majority of the prisoners from the Houthi side or mercenaries have been taken. But if you're looking at actual political prisoners, I think would have been a much more significant swap by the Houthis. There's many Yemeni journalists, other politicians who are in Sana'a in solitary confinement. Some of them are being tortured. Swapping them or allowing them to leave the political prison would have actually been a much more significant gesture on the Houthi side.
Let me move on to Saudi Arabia and its role in this conflict. While the Trump administration is no longer refueling the Saudi airplanes involved in these bombing raids, it continues to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. And we want to put up a tweet by Senator Chris Murphy, critic of the U.S. policy in Yemen and critic of the Saudi policy. And he says, right now in Yemen, the United States is making the same mistakes we made in Iraq. It's time for Congress to wake up and pass our legislation to end our role in this humanitarian nightmare. Is the United States partly to blame for this humanitarian nightmare in Yemen?
I think it would be short-sighted to blame the United States for the humanitarian nightmare. We have to understand that right now there's a strange situation where the legitimate and internationally recognized government of Yemen is currently in Riyadh, the capital city, and has invited the Saudis to intervene. There's not a Saudi-led intervention, but this is actually an invitation of the Yemeni government to intervene against the Houthis. In terms of the U.S. policy in Yemen, especially regarding arms sales to Saudi Arabia, it's also a short-sighted solution. I think your gut reaction is to cut off all weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, assuming that that's going to solve the conflict. That won't solve the conflict. In fact, it will likely exacerbate the conflict because the U.S. is not the only global arms dealer. Saudi Arabia already gets 10% of its arms from China, and there's many other arms dealers, whether China or Russia, who would step in to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. And all that the U.S. would lose would be leverage against Saudi policy. So cutting off weapons, arms sales to Saudi Arabia may be a solution that a lot of people like hearing because it sounds good, but it doesn't necessarily solve the Yemeni conflict. You need to solve the conflict. You need to find out what's driving the conflict. And driving the conflict is not weapons sales.
The UN has called this crisis the worst humanitarian situation in the world. The numbers are absolutely mind-boggling. 22 million, 3/4 of the population in Yemen in desperate need of aid and protection. Thousands have died. Millions are at risk of disease and starvation. The country's infrastructure, as you know, absolutely decimated. And yet it seems the Western world, at least up until now, largely ignored this conflict. Why, Asher?
So Yemen has a long history of famines, of shortages, and has been in lingering crisis already before this conflict began. So this is not a new story that just happened because of this crisis, but it has been exacerbated by the war. It has not been exacerbated by a lack of humanitarian aid, but has actually been exacerbated by a select group, percentage of individuals in Yemen who've taken this war economy and profited from it enormously. They're making fortunes off of humanitarian aid coming in and preventing that aid from actually getting to the people who need it, the people who are starving. And that's part of a larger danger of humanitarian aid, that not given properly, humanitarian aid can actually exacerbate conflict and make humanitarian crises even worse. So there's a incumbent upon both the U.S., the UN, and the international community to give aid more judiciously and more targeted to the actual populations who need it, rather than creating a wartime economy that's disincentivizing any solution to this conflict.
We'll leave it there. Asher Orkaby, thank you.